In this discussion, we are going to talk about reformism and revivalism in Indian Islam. Basically, it concentrates on the way the Indian Muslims came to engage with Western culture and tried to come to terms with British rule after a certain period of defiance against it. It requires a certain understanding of the language of political Islam in modern India, particularly when we see that Muslims since the late 18th century felt that establishment of British rule had destroyed the world of Islamic kingship within which they had lived for so long. The displacement from power of the Muslim rulerships also implied over time displacement of the Muslim aristocracy from positions of power and influence. For example, when Persian was removed as an official language and later replaced by English, they had a feeling of grievance against it. These are more tangible, concrete grievances which could easily contribute to their feeling of alienation from British rule on the one hand and Western culture represented by English language, represented by Christianity, which came as a threat to the purity of Islamic communities in what they usually described as the land of Islam or Darul Islam. Reform and revival, these are more complex questions and they have to be studied at different levels. The problem that we had just raised concerned mainly the elite Muslims, people who held positions of power, who felt that their position was threatened by the emergence of British rule. But there were popular dimensions as well, where puritanical ideas borrowed from Islamic movements energized the peasants in many instances. And there is always this very difficult domain of the relationship between reform and revival.
Sir,
yes?
What was the nature of the relationship between religious reform and revivalism in Indian Islam?
In Indian context where Islam actually came to be implanted in a polytheistic culture, this problem was always very acute. You are all familiar with the Bengal countryside where, popular Islam did not entirely reject idolatrous practices. You have practices like worship of the Sufi saints, the worship of the peers, something that you also see in the rural areas of the Punjab and Sindh. So the reformists would actually insist on purging of these idolatrous practices from popular religious practice. So when we talk about reformism, we talk about two different dimensions of reformism. At one level was the initiative of reform which would purge Islam of the corrupting practices which had crept into Islamic religious practice through its relationship or through its interaction with polytheistic culture, whether in Bengal or in other parts of India where such interaction had taken place. The person who would be keen to remove these practices and to make the practice of Islam more consistent with the texts, with the fundamental religious precepts, would be a reformist. But there would be reformers who would actually go a step forward to move beyond this limited sphere by accepting modernism. So that is where you see two different dimensions of reform. One is reform of the religious practice in line with the theological precepts of the religion, and the other actually takes you to a very different world where the Muslim elites in India, supported by some Islamic scholars, would be trying to come to terms with modernity by accepting features of modernism. In addition, one also has to keep in mind the fact that some of the reformist initiatives in the sense of adoption of a purer version of Islam by purging religious practice of the evil influences of a polytheistic culture destroyed the syncretic culture in the rural areas. So it is not as if that such reformist initiatives were always very conducive for modern Indian politics, for modern Indian culture. It in fact was destructive of some of the syncretic ideas which had influenced the practice of religion in the rural areas. When we talk about reform and revival among Indian Muslims, we have to be very clear of these conceptual problems. Now, there is a particular argument which actually tries to stress this kind of revivalism, where reform of the religion was contingent on the more systematic and purist adoption of theological premises of the religion to the Mughal Empire, associated with the name of Sirhindi, who was critical of the manner in which the Mughal emperors were actually trying to work out compromises with Hindu nobility, with Hindu practices. And this strand of Indian Islam began to gain significant numbers of supporters from the late 18th century onwards in order to cope with displacement from power. They could realize that they were no longer living under a Muslim ruler. Earlier, the question was whether the Mughal emperors were actually behaving in a proper Islamic manner. Now the question is more threatening. It's actually threatening the existence of Islam as the ideology of the ruling power. And in that moment of displacement from power, some of the 18th century thinkers like Shah Waliullah, for example, started emphasizing the Arab connection of Indian Islam and also started emphasizing the need for Indian Muslims to stick to a pure Islamic identity. The Indian identity seemed to have been less important than Muslim identity. But they were confronting a religious world where syncretic traditions had evolved through centuries, since the time when Islam came in touch with these large communities of rural people. And Orthodox Muslims, local priests and others, would actually allow some of these things within the religious practice. It was important for some of these thinkers to challenge the existing religious leadership by claiming the right to interpret religion in order to reform it, and such right to interpret religion freely involved a certain kind of confrontation with orthodoxy. Orthodoxy actually emphasizes the need for the people to follow the regular practices. They are not bothered about whether these practices actually conform to the theological precepts of Islam. They accept this practice because they are actually required to act as guardians of such communities. But the right to interpret religion in a new fashion, to make it more consistent with the theological foundations of the religion as they actually feature in some of the ancient texts, is called Ijtihad. So this is the freedom of interpretation.
Sir,
yes?
What was the long-term implication of Ijtihad in modern Islamic movements in India?
In the first instance, when Shah Waliullah, in order to achieve a purer form of Islam in India, at a time when its existence was apparently threatened by foreign rule, by Christian rule, Ijtihad actually enabled men to think of strengthening Islam with a certain kind of Puritanism, which they found was lacking in Indian Islam. So the emphasis was placed on the connection with Arabia on the one hand, the land where Islam originated, and also emphasis was placed on the requirement of the Muslim communities to follow the religious texts more faithfully. But over time, actually, this right to interpret religion freely would enable Islamic people, communities, to come to terms with modernity more effectively. Because once they realized that the world had changed and it was important for Islamic communities to accept science, accept Western rationality, technology, something which we come across in the personality of Syed Ahmed Khan, the only way to reconcile these changes, which they were required to accept in order to live in a modern world, with their religion, with their faith, was this right of free interpretation, Ijtihad as it was called. It has a certain long-term relevance for the evolution of modern Islam in India. But at the time when Shah Waliullah, to cite one of the most prominent examples in the late 18th century, claimed this right to interpret religion freely in order that religion could be purged of the corruption that had taken place in its practice over time, the point was to strengthen Islam in a relatively hostile environment. So at the time when Shah Waliullah was actually claiming this right in what is known as the Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya in Delhi, and Delhi was an important center of Islamic scholarship since the 16th, 17th centuries, or even from an earlier time, his main concern was to ensure the protection of Islam in a land which had become a land of the infidels, Darul Harb, where Islamic rule was no longer prevailing. Islamic law was no longer determining the legal and the administrative system. So how to achieve Darul Islam again? And Shah Waliullah was a scholar fundamentally who felt the need for the restoration of the purity of Islam. But some of his followers, like for example Sayyid Ahmed Barelvi, known as the Sayyid Ahmed of Bareilly, made a transition from this right of interpretation of Islam freely in order to make it more purer to Jihad. We know the life of Sayyid Ahmed of Barelvi. He was the progenitor of this movement called Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya. And the connection between the right of interpretation, Ijtihad, and Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya is very clear, because Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya implied a reassessment of orthodoxy, existing practice, in terms of the proper knowledge of Islam. The intention is very clear, that there are errors which had in the meanwhile crept into Islamic religious practice. It is important to purge them, and Abdul Aziz, the son of Waliullah, issued apparently the fatwa that every Muslim in India was required to pursue this purer form of Islam in order to bring back the Darul Islam in this country. Sayyid Ahmed of Barelvi's innovation was the Jihad. That is the point of distinction between the master and the disciple. It is said that Waliullah expected that people from the northwestern provinces would intervene in India to restore Darul Islam. Barelvi actually organized a number of resistance movements in the northwestern provinces, but ultimately these resistance movements didn't succeed. In 1831 he died. The movement began to falter. Some of his followers who were located in Patna, Vilayat Ali and Inayat Ali, tried to continue with this tradition, but this tradition ultimately petered out. Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya, however, managed to create certain long-term trends. One of these was the more scholarly trend. Once the more assertive jihadi kind of movement that Sayyid Ahmed Barelvi actually organized petered out, the concentration was once again in Delhi on the legacy of Abdul Aziz and others. So we have a movement called Ali Hadith. It was more puritanical. The leadership came from a man called Sayyid Nazir, who rejected Sufism, who rejected all these forms of peer worship and others, insisted on perfect conformity with the text, some kind of a fundamentalist position on religious practice. And this kind of fundamentalism was as much critical of the kind of corruption which came as a consequence of the interaction with polytheism, but also extremely critical of the orthodoxy. Apart from this scholarly enterprise that we come across in Ali Hadith movement in Delhi, in the hands of theologians, we see a popular dimension of this movement in the countryside also, particularly in Bengal. You are all aware of the Farizis. The name actually is derived from the idea that every Muslim has the obligation or the farz to follow the religious precepts faithfully. And once again, Bengal was a fertile ground for such theologians to come up with their criticism of popular religious practice. Peer system was one of the main targets of their attack. The leadership of the movement came from a man called Haji Shariatullah, who went to Mecca. He studied in the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, imbibed these fundamentalist, purist, puritanical ideas. But apart from that, Hardy also describes them as Islamic lollards.
Sir,
yes?
What is exactly meant by the term Islamic lollardy?
The point is that apart from the insistence on Puritanism that you come across as much in Tariqa in Muhammadiyah and its local version in the movement of Haji Shariatullah, this movement managed to spread its influence among the peasants. When the leaders actually asked the peasants not to pay fees for the Durga Puja festival, say for example, not to pay any illegal taxes to the Hindu landowners. They came up with a certain emancipatory message by way of asking them to avoid paying the rent and other demands to the landowners under the more radical leadership of Shariatullah's son Dudu Miah. Dudu Miah actually radicalized the entire movement by mobilizing opinion in favor of non-payment of taxes to the landlords. This is Islamic lollardy. And lollardy, as you know, was a movement which was powerful and influential among the peasant class communities in England before the Reformation. So, when these movements became blended with a certain kind of agrarian content, it becomes a kind of a popular movement among the peasantry. But as I was saying, that they did not survive for long. In the later half of the 19th century, the Purification movement under the leadership of people like Karamat Ali, for example, accepted British rule, but insisted on purification of Islam. There is a very interesting work by Rafiuddin Ahmed, who suggests that this kind of purification movement continued as Islamic theologians moved in the countryside, held debates, published religious books in vernacular language for the people to practice religion in a proper Islamic manner. These texts were called Nasihatnamas in Bengal. These were written in a kind of a new Islamic Bengali for the consumption of the co-religionists. Bahas was organized, or Waz Mahafils were organized. Basically, these were debates in the local communities about what was the true nature of Islam and the extent to which the practice had deviated from the norms and the need for the people, therefore, to restore its purity. So the purification movement continued, even though kind of jihadism that we see in the early part of the 19th century had petered out. Now, Karamat Ali, of course, represented the very important dimension whereby the Muslims were actually trying to come to terms with the existence of British rule while trying to preserve the sanctity and purity of their religion. How to practice pure religion in a land where they were no longer rulers. This was one dimension. And this was inscribed in the activities of the Deoband school in the later half of the 19th century. In this regard, the revolt of 1857 was an important point of departure. After the revolt of 1857, the British found the Muslims as rebels, and there was an urgency on the part of the Muslim elite to convince the British about the fact that the Muslims were also loyalists. Some were rebels, but many of them were actually loyalists. And that kind of trend was manifest in the activities of a person like Syed Ahmed Khan of Aligarh. So, Karamat Ali, who was a purist, who actually carried on the legacy of early 19th century purification movement, revivalism of a certain kind, but with an eye for reform. Keramat Ali accepted British rule in a way, arguing that India was not a Darul Harb. Muslims can easily live within this world and practice purer form Islam. Similar things were happening in Punjab in a sect called the Ahmadiyas, where there was an insistence on purification, but there was also a readiness to accept the fact of Western rule or British rule. Punjab was a land of very powerful peers, and the practice of peer worship was quite strong in Punjab. So Ahmadiyas, like the Shariatullah movement in the Farizis in Bengal, or their descendants, more purist descendants of the later half of the 19th century, who are actually organizing debates in the countryside to purge religion of these corrupt practices, also insisted on the practice of a purer form of Islam. Now, after 1857, however, we see a different kind of reformist initiative by which Islamic communities were asked to come to terms with modernity. Western modernity to start with, but modernity has a much larger implication. One of the examples is Deoband. Deoband is once again a reformist initiative, inspired by revivalist ideas, insisting on purer form of Islamic practice. But Deoband created an institution. They were trained in Delhi in the same institutions which produced people like Abdul Aziz and his descendants. And eventually, Muhammad Qasim and Rashid Ahmed, these two individuals, set up a seminary at Deoband in a more organized manner, on claiming once again the right to interpret religion freely in order to make religion more consistent with the modern world. But you have, on the other hand, a different kind of initiative, where the right to interpret religion was no longer seen as a right of a select group of theologians, like the men who assembled in the Deoband seminary. The Deobandis believed that only the theologians were actually entitled to interpret religion in their own ways. Others were excluded from this. But you have the need for the people to recognize that in order to come to terms with modernity, Ijtihad would not remain a privilege of a small minority of theologians assembling in religious seminaries or educational institutions, but it's a right which was to be exercised by others also in order to be able to come to terms with modernity, accept modernity.
So, what was the distinction between the Deobandis and the Aligarh school?
I was saying a little while ago that the Deobandis believed that the right to interpret religion is a privilege of the theologians. On the other hand, Syed Ahmed Khan would actually not confine this initiative within the limited theological domain, would actually go a step forward by allowing people to practice Islam, but at the same time to accept modernity by way of accepting modern science and technology. That is where the most important contribution of Syed Ahmed Khan actually lies. Syed Ahmed Khan wanted to see Islam becoming a modern force, where Islamic communities would continue to adhere to the very basic precepts of Islam, but at the same time would be ready to get out of their grooves and accept modernity by responding creatively to the West, by responding creatively to science and technology which came from the West. So he conducted discussions all over India, particularly he came to Calcutta. He found a man with similar views in Syed Amir Ali in Calcutta. He lectured on the need for the Islamic communities to accept science, to adopt modern science. He went to England and was actually impressed by Western culture. So it is in this context that you see a creative engagement among Islamic scholars with the West. And in the later half of the 19th century, there was an urgency for men like Syed Ahmed Khan to engage in this kind of a discourse, to enter into this kind of an engagement with the West, because the position of the Muslim aristocracy in northern India was increasingly threatened by the upwardly mobile Hindu trading classes who had forged links with local Hindu potentates. There was a movement for Nagari. The Arya mobilization in North India was becoming strong. So there was an additional urgency for men like Syed Ahmed Khan to adopt an appropriate strategy whereby Islamic communities would be able to acquire enough strength to compete with this Hindu elite. But 1875 is an important date because in that year, the Aligarh College was established as an institution which precisely tried to work out some of Syed Ahmed's ideas. He gathered around him a group of committed followers, and Aligarh College became the harbingers of modernity in Islam in India.